The Beatles Spectacular is really moving. Woo!
A trip to Miami. The day was Friday, February 7th, 1964. I was getting ready to go on the air, no different than any other day for the past 2 days. Except tonight I would play 1 solid hour of Beatles music. Unheard of in Detroit radio, but I always did those unheard of things, I guess. I promised this for a week. I was a little doubtful about it. Detroit was the most competitive music radio market in the United States. Too competitive, really, to risk losing listeners by playing just one artist, but I'd committed myself. And so, 1 solid hour of Beatles music it was. I had a lot to do on Saturday, record for radio in the morning, rehearse for and do a live 1-hour television show in the afternoon, put my radio show together later that afternoon, and then drive out to Walled Lake Casino so I could get to the remote broadcast by 7:15. At midnight, my day would be over, all 19 hours of it, typical of one of my 7 days a week. Well, Monday, I walked into my office and couldn't believe my eyes. In front of me were hundreds of cards and letters. I had some strange ideas about why they were there. I didn't know if I maybe slipped and said something on the air the wrong way, but when I started reading them, I realized what it was. It was because of all that Beatles music on Saturday night. Each one was thanking me, simply and clearly, just for playing that music. If that many responded just because I'd played an hour of Beatles, what would happen if I actually talked to them and could broadcast whatever was said? Well, the Beatles were in Miami. They just did the Sullivan Show the day before. I, along with 73 million others, watched them. After getting permission from the station management, there was a lot to do. John Dew, my friend and producer, and I were meeting Del Shannon. He was going with us. I called and talked with him on the phone. I asked him if he'd ever met the Beatles while he was working in England, and of course the answer was yes. He said he knew them, and there shouldn't be a problem for Del to get in to see them. Well, it was all set. We were going to Miami, and we were going to interview the Beatles. Well, we had all the cameras, recording devices, and everything else with us, and when we got to Miami, we started making tapes of everything that we said and what everybody else said. We grabbed a cab when we got to the Miami airport. Cabbie said where to. Del said the Deauville Hotel, and we were off. Well, the Deauville was the origination for their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. The cabbie was a man of about 50. He told us he'd been driving around Miami for 30 years. He talked so much, I reached over and turned on the recording device, and we got everything he said. I think he knew more about the Beatles than we did. He told us they arrived at the same airport that we'd just come from. There was mass panic. He'd never seen so many people turn out to greet anybody. There was so much traffic jammed up for so long, he and his cab made a small fortune. It took me 3 times as long to drive anywhere. I collected double, triple fares, he said. He told us one of the local radio stations dressed up their air people to look like Beatles. Just as the plane landed, they all ran out from behind a big truck. Throngs thought for a minute that they were actually really seeing the Beatles, and they were mobbed. Lucky, nobody was hurt. To sum it all up, the Beatles caused absolute pandemonium in Miami from the time they arrived until the time they left. The lobby of the hotel was absolutely jammed. People were everywhere. Old people, parents, children, teenagers, bellboys, everybody. Everybody was talking. Nobody was listening. I was trying to hide the recording device because it had the name of my radio station on it, and I knew that if anybody saw it, we'd be mobbed. Del Shannon asked the man behind the desk for the room number of the Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein. He'd met Brian on 2 occasions while he was in England. Brian had sent him an invitation to stop by and say hi if he happened to be near Miami during their visit. Well, we were stopping by to do more than just say hello. But first, we had to get the manager's permission. When we finally got his attention, the man behind the desk barked, "I am not allowed to give that information out." So Del went to a phone, asked for an outside line, called the hotel, and asked for Brian Epstein's room. Turned out the operator asked him who was calling, and of course he said, Del Shannon. There was a slight delay, which seemed like an eternity. Finally, I heard Del saying, "Hey, Brian, how you doing?" We made the contact. Del was talking to the man who could give us a simple yes to our request and get us the interview. Del was saying, "Yeah, I'm right here in the lobby. Are the Beatles in?" Oh, they are. Well, that's about all that happened out of that conversation. They'd be talking to nobody, according to Epstein. We didn't know what to do. We were up a blind alley, and it seemed that there was nothing we could do. Just then, Del said, "Don't look now, but that guy walking toward us with the dark glasses, that's Brian Epstein." He walked over to where we were standing, greeted Del with a big smile and a handshake. Del introduced him to me. He wasn't quite as friendly with me as he was to Del, but we were a lot better off than we had been a few minutes ago. Just then, another man walked over and whispered something into Epstein's ear. That little gesture would turn out to be the key to our whole trip. Brian Epstein was a tall, slightly built man in his early 30s. After listening to the whispered message, he turned and introduced his informant to Del and me as Mr. Jack Millman of Miami. We found out later Jack was the Capitol record representative for Miami. His job was to see that the Beatles got from place to place all in one piece without being molested by anybody. Then, just as easily as if he were to tell the time of day, Epstein looked at Del and said, "I'm sure the boys would like to see you. Could you come back about 5 o'clock, have dinner with them in the room?" Well, it was 2:30 in the afternoon. What were we going to do between now and then? Incidentally, that invitation did not include yours truly. I went to the desk and asked for a room. The man told me in order to get a room there, I would have had to do this 6 months ago. Matter of fact, he said there were no rooms available in any good hotels up and down the beach. He told me if I wanted a room, and I didn't care what it was like, I should call the dump down the street. He thought there was a possibility at least, so off we went. Jack Millman, Del Shannon, John Dew, and I were on our way to see if there was a room at the dump down the street. Well, I'll tell you one thing. The guy at the Deauville wasn't kidding. The place was definitely a dump with a capital D, but there was a room available. According to the proprietor, it was probably the last available room on the strip, so there we were. We had our room at the dump, waiting for 5 o'clock. Del would go back to the Deauville, have dinner with the Beatles. Jack Millman was a short, stocky guy with a genial manner about him. I asked if he could have dinner with John and me. He said he would, and we started to talk. Turned out he'd been in the record business for a long time, knew all about yours truly and our shows in Detroit, too. Even knew a lot of people I knew. Conversation became long and involved. He told me he'd been assigned to take care of the Beatles while they were in Miami. Met him at the airport. Everything he said was absolutely fascinating. He said the Beatles would be doing 2 shows on Sunday, one in the afternoon, dress rehearsal, and one at night, which was, of course, their live appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. And it was live, by the way, in those days. The week before, they gave out 5,000 tickets for each show, and there were only 2,000 seats. It was a mess, he said. I was just listening, fascinated. Kids couldn't even hear them singing. They were all screaming and clapping and crying and yelling. Technicians for the TV show had trouble putting the mics in the right place so the Beatles wouldn't be totally drowned out for the millions who were watching television at home. Well, if you were listening when I was broadcasting the interviews on the radio later, you heard Mr. Millman himself utter those very words. I was recording the whole conversation, of course, just like now. Well, they're still the same, Del said when he got back. He was so excited I had a hard time trying to calm down. What about it? Do we get the interview? Well, it doesn't look too good, he said. They were happy to see me, but no interviews. I went to the telephone, asked for long distance, and called a radio guy in New York that I knew. I was calling Murray Kaufman. Murray the K, they called him. He knew the Beatles from some connection in England. I asked him if he could put forth any influence to get me in to see them. He said he'd try. After that, there was a series of calls going back and forth, New York, Deauville, dump, back again. Meanwhile, Jack Millman left to go back to the Deauville himself to see what he could do. Well, by now it was after midnight. Jack had been gone for a couple of hours. Del was asleep. I was wide awake, staring at the wall, waiting for the phone to ring or a knock at the door. By this time, the Beatles knew all about me and why I was there, and I hoped it had all done some good. There was a knock at the door. There stood Jack Millman, and he said, "You got it." What? I got what? You got the interview, Lee. Interview with the Beatles. I couldn't believe it. I shook him a little bit. I think I jumped up and down, danced around. You know what you're saying? Yeah, I know what I'm saying. Don't tear my suit. I can remember that, too. I apologized. All those calls from Murray Kaufman, they only made it tougher. The Beatles don't like him, he said. You know what did it? Simple. I finally convinced them you'd come all the way from Detroit just to get this interview, and there were thousands of people back there who'd be disappointed if they wouldn't talk to you. Well, I was really stunned. All of that activity, all that pandemonium in Miami, and I was going to get an interview. Jack Millman went on. It was Ringo. Ringo finally said he'd consent to the interview if the others would. As soon as he said that, it was all set. 11 in the morning, he said. Meet me at the Deauville tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock. Make sure that machine's working. You got one shot, and that's it. Well, by now you might have guessed there was no sleep for me. I was up the rest of the night, making sure that everything worked. 10:30 in the morning, Del, John, and I started for the Deauville. Same scene there, people everywhere, talking, yelling, laughing. We climbed the stairs, went into the hotel, and there was Jack Millman sitting on a sofa right by the elevator. Sit down, he said. I'm going to go up to 12:15 now. Be ready when I come down, and we'll get started before anybody changes their mind. The events of the past 48 hours were a blur in my mind. 12:15 was the room number of the Beatles. Well, if I had to write this story then, I never could have done it. It all ran together in my head. I had to think twice to remember what day it was. It was noon. I'd been waiting for an hour and a half, and still no Jack Millman. I was getting a little worried. Waited another hour. Del went to make arrangements for the flight home. Just then the elevator opened. Jack stepped out, motioned to me, and said, "Let's go." "Come on, John," I said. "Only you, Lee." "Sorry, John." And oh, yes, don't bring that camera. Leave the camera here. And that's why there's never been a photograph or a picture of what happened. Well, all the way up, elevators, police, guards, Jack showed his credentials, like the Secret Service going through that gauntlet. We got up to the 12th floor. There were 6 rooms in that short hallway. In front of each room was a Miami policeman. 6 rooms, one for each of Brian Somerville, the Beatles, publicity manager, Brian Epstein, John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and Paul McCartney. We walked to the last room on our left. The policeman tapped on the door, and when it opened, a man stepped out, and it was Brian Somerville. He introduced himself, told us he was in charge of all the Beatles publicity. I asked him if I could talk to him on tape, and he said he'd be glad to, but right now, if I didn't mind, the Beatles were ready to talk with me. The door opened, and there they were, right in front of me, just like they'd been waiting the whole time. There were the Beatles from Liverpool, England. Look at the pictures from back then. Pictures of those guys arriving at the airport and so forth. That's exactly what they looked like. We were all kids. Somerville introduced me to all 4. I fumbled with the recording device, and I'll stop here. This was not in the written part of the book. It was not a tape machine. There were no tape machines small enough in those days for us to carry, or at least that we could get our hands on. This was a wire recorder, believe it or not. And that's why the sound quality of the actual interview is less than what we're used to today, if you've ever heard it. Well, that room was lined with boxes of mail from all over the world. There were 2 beds in the room. It was a regular hotel room. John and Ringo sat on one bed, George and Paul on the other, and I sat on the chair in between the beds with a microphone in my hand. To my right was a huge picture window, and there was the ocean as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful, obviously. Just a beautiful day in Miami, as usual. All 4 of the Beatles were dressed in their bathing suits because they were going to a private home after this for a little R&R. Well, we began to talk. All during the interview, I was thinking how easygoing these guys were, how natural, relaxed they were, and I was thinking, here are 4 good-natured English guys who've become more popular than any other 4 people in show business in the world, on that day anyway. They were talented, sharp-witted, full of fun, and their success was not affected by their ego. 4 regular guys. Well, I won't describe the interview because if you haven't heard it, you will. When it was over, and after I had interviewed Brian Somerville, we were on our way. We had seen, met, and talked with the Beatles, who were the most talked about 4 people in the world on that day. We'd been successful after all. It was a long journey, and now we were on our way back to cold, snowy Detroit. So that's how it happened. When I got back to Detroit, the engineers and I edited the tape and got it on the air every now and then. For years afterwards, I received a card from the 4 Beatles on my birthday. Sometimes just a phone call, if they could get to a phone and felt like it. Now archived and standard in every library, their music remains a part of us. Of course, tragedy took John's life, and when I wrote this book, George was just gone as well. I remember them as 4 guys about my age who were having fun, absolutely overwhelmed by the magic of their instant success. And Ringo, if you ever hear this, I want you to know there's a guy who will never forget what you did for me and a few thousand listeners in Detroit when I took that trip to Miami. Oh, yes, the station paid for the trip and even the room charges at the dump. And then a few weeks later, my life would take a dramatic and deadly turn. John Dew remembers what happened in those few days differently than I do. In a recent email, which, by the way, did not exist when we took our trip to Miami, in a recent email, he wrote, and I'll quote him here, "I'll never forget the thrill of getting on a chartered jet flight, Eastern Airlines. There were just 3 of us on the whole plane going to Miami. You, Del Shannon, and me, Lee. Somehow you had convinced Chuck Fritz that you could land an exclusive interview with the Beatles. WABC in New York couldn't even swing enough clout to get an interview, but you could. Your ace in the hole, of course, was Del Shannon. Even so, there was no guarantee. They were the hottest commodities in the world. Having taken New York by storm via the Ed Sullivan Show, now they were starting their U.S. tour, and every TV and radio station in the country wanted to be in on that action. I thought then that the one thing you never lacked, Lee, was confidence. It took Del and every other string you could pull, push, or yank, but you did it. You got the interview. I couldn't go, even though I was supposed to be your engineer. Del couldn't even go in their room, just you. It was a fabulous coup. Well, Lee, then we came back to Earth. We checked into a cheap motel for the night, had to ride back like common folk on a commercial flight, coach class no less, but it was all worth it. You had a world exclusive for WXYZ. They sold it, as I recall, for a ton of advertising dollars, and we eventually put out a 45 RPM recording of the trip and raised a lot of money for charity. It would never happen today. TV would pay millions for exclusivity, and radio would be and also ran. Thank God for the good old days. End quote. Signed, John Dew, General Manager, WJZQ, 92.9 The Breeze, Traverse City, Michigan.
This is Lee Allen, and we have come from Detroit, a couple of thousand miles by plane to talk with the Beatles, and they have been gracious enough to permit us to come up and talk with them. They're on a vacation. There we are. I can't. You guys are in key, but I'm out.
Yeah.
Let's identify the voices. First of all, I recognize Ringo. Ringo, good to have you.
Hello. How you doing? Good to see you.
And here.
Go on. Here.
All right, now wait a minute. I got to. George, right?
No.
Wrong. Now I'm going to get put onto the whole.
You are, yeah. Go on.
I got 2 more guesses.
Try and get me, Harry.
Trying to get you, Harry. All right. Now, John.
Listen, kids, don't ever listen to him again. He's off his head. He doesn't know one from the other kids. Okay? Don't listen to this program.
Tell me about. Not right now.
We got some Stamp Out the Beatles sweaters.
You've got Stamp Out the Beatles sweaters?
Mm-hmm.
Where'd you get them?
From Detroit.
Did you really? Did a guy send them to you?
Yeah, somebody sent us from Detroit, so we just changing it around to Stamp Out Detroit. You know.
It's a big joke with us kids. How did you hear about the Stamp Out the Beatles thing?
As soon as we got off the plane, somebody in the news conference, press conference, said, "What are you going to do in answer to this Stamp Out the Beatles campaign?" I heard about it in Cashbox before we came over. Oh, yeah. It was in Cashbox.
An English Cashbox?
Well, you know, it's the American magazine. I heard about it when I was 7 at school. Somebody told me about it. But I've had telegrams and letters from kids in Detroit saying it's only about 10 people who want to stump us out.
It's at the University of Detroit, which is like down here at the Miami.
I'll tell you what, we just had a fraternity plaque from the University of Miami. Very nice. Nice university. Bad university, Detroit.
I think some of the guys and gals would be interested in knowing what were the Beatles before you were a group. I mean, were you all friends? Did you know each other?
Well, we were at school, and when we were about 17, we left school, and we just turned semi-professional. We went to Germany for about 4 months, and, you know, we'd just been semi-professional right after school, and then we managed to make a record in England about 18 months ago, and that was when Ringo joined us. Because before then Ringo just got in on the bandwagon.
He just moved in.
I just made him. Ringo was, you know, a fellow that we'd known for quite a bit, and we liked him. Good old Ringo. It's all changed. He was a good. No, you know, so that's when Ringo joined, and we've been together then since 40 years. We've been together now for 40 years, and it don't seem a day too much.
I noticed you were listening to a Martha and the Vandellas
B-side
record here in the hotel room.
Well,
that stuff all comes out of Detroit, like Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye and the Marvelettes.
Hey, very good. We love them.
They're nice people, and the stuff they have is our American rock or rhythm and blues.
Yeah.
But your things, especially the lyrics, They hit home with the kids, but they're different. How do you go about it? Is there any method?
There's no method or no kind of formula at all. Just if we fancy an idea for a song or an idea for a few notes that we like or something like that, then we start doing a song around it. But we haven't got any formula at all. There's no such thing like John comes up one day with all the lyrics and I do all the music to it.
How do you like Florida, by the way?
Oh, marvelous, yeah.
Great.
How about this? How about the Beatles are here? I understand there were fantastic mobs at the airport.
Oh, yeah.
And here at the Deauville for the show. We know that you did one show in the afternoon, a dress rehearsal.
Yeah.
We saw the one in Detroit.
And then we stripped off and did the night show.
Yeah. But what about how can you possibly have a vacation? How can you have a holiday with guys like me coming to bug you?
Well, you're we let you two especially because you're from Detroit.
You're the only one.
I love you. I love you.
No, nobody else will probably. We won't do anything else this week. No, we're off now till Friday. It's not very long, but it'll just give us a chance to rest.
We're going to have a proper vacation.
EAC.
What about the Four Seasons? They're your counterpart.
I haven't actually bought one of the records, but I like the records.
We prefer the Miracles.
And Marvin Gaye and, Esther Phillips and
Ronettes. The Ronettes.
Yeah.
I want to
Hold your hand.
hold your hand. That's the big. That's one of the jokes in town. What did one Beatle say to the other? I want to hold your hand. True. Okay, we got to wrap it up because you guys have got to go.
Okay.
Sun is
calling.
And I want to thank all of you for.
We'd like to thank you. You were one of the first to play our records in America.
Have you got anything that you'd like to say to Detroit or Chicago, New York, or wherever this thing might be played, Ringo?
Thank you. Thanks a lot for buying the records, and we'd like to thank Ed Sullivan for letting us over so we could meet you all. That's about it.
Yeah, we're going to try and get back sometime this year. About September, I think. So don't go away.
Okay, thank you very much, guys.
Okay, thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you.
We love you.